Welcome to the Mundane Museum. I am your curator. Tonight, we'll explore the ancient world of Sumer and Akkad, where humanity first learned to build cities, write stories, and dream of the stars. Let yourself relax as we travel together to the land between two rivers. Our story begins in southern Mesopotamia, a region that would become known as the Fertile Crescent. Here, between the flowing waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, something remarkable happened. Put from around 4100 BCE to 1900 BCE, the Sumerian civilization took root and flourished. This span of over 2,000 years saw the birth of ideas and innovations that still echo through our world today. Imagine standing in that ancient landscape. The land stretched out flat and endless in every direction, broken only by marshes and wetlands. There were no forests here, no tall trees to provide shade or timber. The sky arched overhead, vast and often merciless. Rainfall was scarce, a precious gift that came too rarely. And yet, paradoxically, this dry land lived under constant threat from its rivers. When the floods came, they came with devastating force, sweeping away everything in their path. It was not an easy place to live. The environment presented challenge after challenge to the people who called it home. But human ingenuity has always risen to meet difficulty, and the ancient Sumerians were nothing if not ingenious. The early leaders of Sumerian society were priest-kings, figures who combined religious authority with practical governance. These weren't merely ceremonial rulers. They understood that survival in this harsh landscape required organization, cooperation, and careful planning. And so they set their people to work on projects that would transform the land itself. Under the direction of these priest-kings, the Sumerians built an intricate network of irrigation canals. They constructed dikes to hold back the destructive floods. They created reservoirs to capture and store the precious water when it did come. This wasn't the work of a single generation. It took centuries of sustained effort, of maintaining and expanding these waterworks, of passing down knowledge from father to son, from mother to daughter. Slowly, remarkably, the irrigation systems began to work their magic. The desert, that barren and unforgiving landscape, started to transform. Water flowed where it was needed, when it was needed. Seeds could be planted with confidence. The soil, rich with silt from the rivers, proved remarkably fertile when given the water it craved. The transformation was profound. Desert became farmland. Farmland became productive. Unproductive land yielded something that had never existed before in such abundance: surplus. The Sumerians grew barley, that ancient grain that would sustain civilizations for millennia. They cultivated date palms, those graceful trees that could thrive in the heat and provide sweet fruit year after year. For the first time in human history, not everyone needed to farm. When there's surplus food, some people can specialize in other tasks. Craftspeople could focus on their crafts. Priests could tend to temples. Scribes could develop writing. Administrators could organize society. And all of these specialists could live together in close proximity. In something new under the sun. Cities became possible. This is perhaps the most important fact to understand about ancient Sumer. The cities didn't appear by accident or by the will of the gods alone. They emerged because the environment demanded innovation, and innovation created surplus, and surplus made urban life possible. The environmental limits of Mesopotamia, those challenges of flood and drought, of flat marshland and scarce timber, shaped everything that followed, every ziggurat that would rise toward the heavens, every cuneiform tablet that would record laws and poems, by every advance in mathematics and astronomy, every god and goddess worshipped in the temples. All of it flowed from this fundamental reality. The Sumerians learned to work with their environment, to channel its power, to transform its challenges into opportunities. As you drift toward sleep, picture those ancient canals, water flowing steadily through human-made channels, bringing life to the land. Picture the barley fields swaying in the warm breeze, golden and abundant. Picture the first cities rising from the plain, mud brick buildings clustered together, the sounds of humanity learning to live in a new way. The story of Sumer is the story of human resilience and creativity. It's a reminder that our ancestors faced tremendous challenges and met them with determination and intelligence. In the land between two rivers, civilization began. And it all started with water, earth, and human hands working together to create something new. As the Sumerian world grew and flourished, fed by those life-giving irrigation systems, something fascinating began to happen across the landscape of southern Mesopotamia. Cities emerged, not as a single unified kingdom, but as independent centers of power and culture. Each city developed its own identity, its own patron deity, its own way of doing things. This was the age of the city-states. Among the most prominent of these urban centers were Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, and Nippur. Each name carries weight in the history of human civilization. These weren't just settlements or villages that had grown large. They were true cities, bustling with tens of thousands of people, centers of trade and religion, politics and art. Uruk, perhaps the greatest of them all, shone like a jewel on the Mesopotamian plain. Archaeological evidence suggests it may have housed as many as 50,000 people at its height, making it quite possibly the largest city in the world during its time. Ur became legendary, remembered even in biblical texts as the home of Abraham. Lagash was known for its powerful rulers and constant struggles with neighboring cities. Eridu claimed to be the oldest city of all, sacred in Sumerian tradition as the first city created by the gods. And Nippur held special status as a religious center, home to Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon. These cities didn't always get along. They were independent, which meant they were also competitive, vied for control of water resources, for trade routes, for prestige and power. Sometimes they cooperated, but often they quarreled. Yet each maintained its own sovereignty, its own government. its own fierce pride. When you approached one of these ancient cities from across the flat Mesopotamian plain, the first thing you would see would be its walls. Every major Sumerian city was surrounded by defensive fortifications. Massive walls built of mud brick, punctuated by towers that rose even higher. These walls served multiple purposes. They protected against raiders and rival cities, certainly, but they also made a statement. They announced to the world, here is civilization, here is order, here is power. Consider the walls of Uruk, which, according to ancient sources and modern archaeology, stretched roughly 6 miles in circumference. 6 miles of wall, thick enough and high enough to withstand assault, built brick by human hands. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that ancient story we'll hear more about later, boasts of these walls, describing them as a wonder of the world. Go up and walk on the ramparts of Uruk, the epic says, inviting the reader to marvel at their construction. Building such walls required enormous resources and organization. Workers had to manufacture millions of mud bricks, each one formed in molds and dried in the sun. They had to transport these bricks to the construction site. They had to stack them with precision, creating structures that could stand for centuries. It was a collective effort, a testament to what humans could achieve when they worked together toward a common goal. Inside these protective walls, the city had its own geography, its own hierarchy written in stone and brick. At the very heart of each Sumerian city stood the temple complex, the most important and impressive architectural feature. These weren't simple shrines. They were elaborate compounds that included the ziggurat, that distinctive stepped pyramid tower that reached toward the heavens, along with various temple buildings, courtyards, storerooms, and workshops. The temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was the economic and administrative center of the city. The priests who served there managed vast estates, collected taxes and offerings, distributed rations, kept records. In many ways, the temple was the beating heart of urban life, the place where the human and divine worlds intersected, where earthly needs were met under the watchful eyes of the gods. Life within the city walls varied dramatically depending on who you were. For ordinary people, for the farmers and laborers, the craftspeople and shopkeepers who made up the vast majority of the population, home was modest. Most lived in simple mud brick houses, small structures that might have just a few rooms. Some, especially in the earlier periods or in poorer areas, lived in houses made of reeds, those marsh plants that grew so abundantly in the wetlands of southern Mesopotamia. These reed houses were ingenious in their own way, perfectly adapted to the local environment. The reeds were bundled together and bent to form arches, creating structures that were surprisingly sturdy and well insulated against the heat. They cost little to build and could be erected quickly. For many families, a red house was not a sign of poverty, but simply a practical choice. The mud brick houses were more permanent, built to last for generations. They typically had flat roofs where families could sleep on hot nights, catching whatever breeze might stir. The walls were thick, providing insulation from the brutal summer heat. Windows were small and placed high, again to keep out the heat, while allowing some light to enter. Inside, the rooms were simple, furnished with whatever the family could make or afford. But not everyone lived so simply. As you moved through the city, you would notice larger, more elaborate homes. These belonged to the officials and administrators who kept the city running, to the wealthy merchants who traded far and wide, and especially to the priests who served in the temples. These residences might have multiple stories. Numerous rooms arranged around a central courtyard, decorated walls, and fine furnishings. This architectural hierarchy reflected the social hierarchy. You could read the structure of society in the very layout of the city. Be the temple at the center, vast and magnificent. Be the homes of the elite nearby, comfortable and spacious, and spreading outward the neighborhoods where ordinary people lived their lives, working and loving and dreaming under the same sun that shone on everyone. Yet, for all these differences, everyone was part of the same urban community. Rich and poor alike depended on those irrigation canals, on the city walls for protection, on the surplus that made city life possible. They worshipped the same gods, followed the same laws, spoke the same language. They were, all of them, citizens of Uruk, or Yor, of Lagash, or Eridu, or NIPP, or NIPP. You are. As you relax and let your mind wander through these ancient streets, picture the morning light touching those defensive walls. Picture the temple rising above the rooftops, its cigarette visible from every part of the city. Picture the narrow streets winding between houses, the sounds of daily life echoing off mud brick walls. Picture people going about their business, living lives not so different in their basic rhythms from our own. In cities that were already ancient when Rome was born, the city-states of Sumer were humanity's first great urban experiment, and they succeeded beyond anything their founders could have imagined. In their walls and temples, their houses grand and humble, they created spaces where civilization could flourish. And flourish it did, for over 2,000 years, leaving behind a legacy that shapes our world even now. The Sumerians had a distinctive way of referring to themselves. They called themselves the black-headed people. This wasn't a reference to any particular ethnic characteristic that we can identify today. Rather, it seems to have been a way of distinguishing themselves from their neighbors, from outsiders, from those who didn't share their language and culture. To be black-headed was to be Sumerian, to belong to the civilization between the rivers, to be part of something special and enduring within this community of black-headed people. Society was carefully structured and organized. Like virtually all ancient civilizations, Sumer was hierarchical. People occupied different levels of society with different rights, different responsibilities, different opportunities. At the top were the rulers, the kings and queens who governed the city-states. Just below them stood the priests, those sacred intermediaries between the human and divine worlds, who wielded enormous religious and economic power. The scribes occupied a position of particular prestige. In a world where literacy was rare, where the ability to read and write the complex cuneiform script required years of training, scribes were indispensable. They kept the records, wrote the contracts, copied the literature, and preserved the knowledge of the past. A scribe might not have been as wealthy as a merchant or as powerful as a priest, but they commanded respect. Their skill with the stylus and clay tablet opened doors that remained closed to others. Below the scribes came the craftsmen, the skilled workers who produced the goods that made civilization possible. Potters and weavers, metal workers and jewelers, carpenters and leather workers. Each had their specialty, their expertise passed down through generations. These were respectable positions, essential to the functioning of society. The farmers, who actually produced the food that sustained everyone else, were numerous and vital. Though they occupied a lower social position than the specialized craftsmen. This may seem strange to us, but it reflected the agricultural surplus of Mesopotamia. Food was relatively abundant when the harvests were good, while skilled craftsmanship was rarer and more valued. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the slaves. Slavery existed in Sumer, as it did in virtually every ancient society. Some slaves were prisoners of war. Others had been sold into slavery by their families during times of hardship, or had sold themselves to pay off debts. Still others were born into slavery. It's important to note that slavery in Sumer was different in some ways from slavery in other times and places. Slaves had certain rights, could sometimes own property, and could potentially buy their freedom. But they were still unfree, still subject to the will of their owners, still occupying the lowest rung of society. Yet, for all its hierarchy, Sumerian society wasn't entirely rigid. Social mobility was possible, and one of the primary paths upward was through education. A talented young person from a modest background could attend the Edabar, the school where scribes were trained, and emerge with a skill that would elevate their entire family's status. The life of a scribe was comfortable, secure, and respected. Many Sumerian texts emphasize the advantages of becoming a scribe compared to other professions. The priesthood offered another avenue for advancement. Temples were always looking for capable people to manage their vast estates and complex operations. A smart, devoted individual could rise through the temple hierarchy, gaining wealth and influence along the way. Some of the most powerful figures in Sumerian cities were priests who had started from relatively humble origins. Family life in Sumer was governed by laws and customs that might surprise us with their formality and sophistication. Marriage wasn't simply a private agreement between two people. It was a legal contract written on clay tablets and witnessed by others. These marriage contracts specified the bride price that the groom's family would pay, the dowry that the bride would bring, and the rights and obligations of both parties. This formality had real benefits. It meant that marriage was taken seriously as a legal institution. It meant that both parties had clearly defined rights that could be enforced. And perhaps most remarkably to modern eyes, it meant that divorce was legally permitted. A marriage that had broken down could be formally ended, with the law specifying how property would be divided and what obligations would continue. Divorce wasn't necessarily easy or socially desirable, but it was possible. A man could divorce his wife, though he might have to return her dowry and pay compensation. A woman could also initiate divorce under certain circumstances, particularly if her husband had mistreated her or failed to provide for her. These weren't just theoretical rights. We have actual legal documents recording divorces, showing that real Sumerian couples made use of these provisions. The law codes of Sumer reveal a society that thought carefully about justice and punishment. The law code of Yuanamu, dating to around 2100 BCE, is one of the earliest legal codes we know of. What's fascinating about this code is its preference for monetary fines rather than physical punishment. If someone caused an injury, they typically had to pay compensation to the victim rather than suffering an equivalent injury themselves. This stands in interesting contrast to the later, more famous code of Hammurabi from Babylon, which often prescribed an eye for an eye type punishments. The Sumerian approach was more pragmatic in some ways. A fine compensated the victim for their loss and suffering, while physical punishment merely added more suffering to the world without necessarily making things better. The law regulated many aspects of life: property rights, inheritance rules, business contracts, agricultural agreements, everything that was needed to make a complex urban society function smoothly. If you bought a house, the transaction would be recorded on a clay tablet. If you entered into a business partnership, the terms would be written down. If you borrowed grain or silver, the loan and its interest would be documented. One aspect of Sumerian law that stands out, especially compared to many later societies, is the rights afforded to women. Women in Sumer could own property in their own name. They could buy and sell land, houses, and goods. They could run businesses, engaging in trade and commerce independently. We have records of women working as merchants, tavern keepers, and managers of estates. This economic independence gave women a degree of autonomy that would be unthinkable in many later civilizations. A woman's property couldn't simply be taken by her husband or male relatives. If she was divorced or widowed, she retained her own wealth. If she was a successful businesswoman, she could accumulate significant resources and pass them on to her children. Beyond economic rights, some women held positions of considerable religious power. The institution of the Intu priestess was particularly important. These were high-ranking priestesses, often daughters of kings, who served specific deities and wielded significant authority. The Entu of the moon god Nana at Yor, for example, was one of the most important religious figures in that city. The most famous example is an daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who served as high priestess of the moon god at Yor. But Enheduanna was more than just a priestess. She was a poet, the author of hymns and devotional works that have survived to this day. She's often considered the first author in history whose name we actually know, man or woman. Her works weren't anonymous. She signed them. She wanted to be remembered, and she has been for over 4,000 years. Other women served as Naditu priestesses, dedicating their lives to the gods and living in special cloisters. These women couldn't marry or have children, but they could own property, engage in business, and live with considerable independence. For some women, especially those from wealthy families, becoming a Naditu was an attractive option, offering security and autonomy, even among ordinary women. Life in Sumer offered certain protections and opportunities. Mothers were respected, and the bond between mother and child was considered sacred. Women worked in many occupations, from weaving and brewing to music and midwifery. They participated in festivals and religious ceremonies. They raised children, managed households, and contributed to the economic life of their communities. This isn't to say that Sumer was a society of gender equality as we understand it today. It wasn't. Men held most positions of political and military power. Women's lives were often constrained by expectations about marriage and family. But compared to many societies that would come later, Sumerian women had meaningful legal rights and real economic agency. As you relax into sleep, picture the bustling streets of ancient Ur or Uruk. Picture women running taverns, selling goods in the marketplace, managing family estates. Picture scribes from modest backgrounds bent over their tablets, recording the complex transactions that made civilization work. Picture the hierarchies of society, yes, but also the pathways through those hierarchies, the possibilities for a life of dignity and purpose at every level. The black-headed people built a society that was both structured and flexible, traditional and innovative. They created laws to govern their affairs, contracts to secure their agreements, and institutions that allowed both men and women to participate in civic and economic life. In the clay tablets they left behind, we can read the details of their marriages and divorces, their business dealings and legal disputes, their aspirations and achievements. These weren't primitive people living simple lives. They were sophisticated urbanites navigating complex social structures, using written law to resolve conflicts, educating their children for better futures, building businesses and managing estates. In many ways, their concerns were our concerns. Their challenges were our challenges, separated only by the vast river of time. When we think of the great cities of ancient Sumer, with their towering ziggurats and massive defensive walls, it's easy to imagine them filled with priests and scribes, merchants and craftsmen. And certainly, all these people were present. But the truth is that most people, the vast majority of the population, even in these urban centers, were farmers. The black-headed people were fundamentally an agricultural civilization. These farmers didn't live scattered across the countryside as we might expect. Instead, they lived inside the city walls. In those mud brick and red houses we discussed earlier, packed together in neighborhoods with their fellow citizens. Each morning, as the sun rose over the flat Mesopotamian plain. They would walk out through the great gates of the city to the fields that lay beyond. Imagine that daily journey. The farmers would gather their tools, perhaps share a simple breakfast of bread and beer, and then join the stream of people heading out to work. Through the narrow streets they'd walk past the central temple complex, past the homes of the wealthy, past shops and workshops already stirring to life. Then through the massive gates in the city wall, nodding to the guards who stood watch there, bend out into the open land beyond. The fields stretched out in all directions, divided by irrigation canals that caught the morning light. Some farmers would walk only a short distance. Others might travel a mile or more to reach their assigned plots. All day they would work under that hot Mesopotamian sun, planting or weeding or harvesting, maintaining the canals, tending to the crops that fed the city. And then, as evening approached and the heat began to fade, they would make the journey back, returning to the safety and community of the city before the gates closed for the night. This daily pattern of movement between city and countryside was fundamental to Sumerian life. It meant that even farmers were urbanites, participating in city culture, worshipping at city temples, buying goods in city markets. They weren't isolated rural peasants, but integrated members of urban society who happened to work in agriculture. But not everyone farmed. The cities supported a remarkable diversity of occupations. Craftsmen of every description plied their trades. The potter worked at his wheel, shaping clay into vessels for water, beer, grain, and oil. The weaver sat at her loom, transforming wool and flax into textiles. The metalworker hammered copper and bronze into tools, weapons, and ornaments. The carpenter shaped the precious imported wood into furniture and fittings. Traders were essential to urban life. Because the Mesopotamian plain lacked many resources, there was no stone for building, no timber for construction, no metal ores for tools and weapons. All these had to be imported from distant lands. So Sumerian traders traveled far and wide, down the Persian Gulf to trade for copper from Magan, overland to Anatolia for silver and tin, east to the Indus Valley for precious stones and exotic goods. There the links connecting Sumer to the wider world. Closer to home, fishers worked the rivers and marshes, bringing in fish that provided protein to supplement the grain-heavy diet of most Sumerians. The Tigris and Euphrates, along with the extensive wetlands of southern Mesopotamia, teemed with fish. Fishing wasn't the most prestigious occupation, but it was steady and necessary. Hunters, too, played their role. Though hunting was becoming less important as society became more urbanized and agricultural, still there were waterfowl in the marshes, gazelles on the plains, and occasionally more dangerous game. Some hunting was for food, some for sport, and some was symbolic, as kings hunted lions to demonstrate their power and bravery. For children life followed different paths depending on their family's circumstances and aspirations. If a family could afford it, if they had the resources and the ambition, they might send a son to school. And in Sumer, school meant the Idaba, literally the tablet house, where boys were trained to become scribes. Not every family could afford this. Scribal education took years, during which the student wasn't contributing to the family's income. The school itself charged fees. It was an investment, and like all investments, it required resources that many families simply didn't have. But for those who could manage it, scribal training offered the promise of a better life. The curriculum was demanding. Students, boys, typically ranging from early childhood to their teenage years, would spend long hours in the tablet house. They sat on the floor or on benches, clay tablets on their laps, styluses in hand. The teaching method was based on repetition and copying. Master scribes had created textbook tablets, model texts that students would copy over and over again. These textbook tablets covered everything a scribe needed to know. There were lists of Sumerian words and their meanings, essential for learning the language. There were mathematical tables for learning calculation. There were model contracts and legal documents, so students would know how to draft them properly. There were proverbs and wise sayings, literary texts and hymns, even model complaint letters about poor service or defective goods. A student might copy the same tablet dozens of times, gradually improving their script, to internalizing the vocabulary, absorbing the knowledge. It was tedious work, and we have texts that suggest students didn't always love their studies. One Sumerian text records a schoolboy's complaints about his long days and strict teachers, and another tells of a father checking on his son's progress and finding it wanting. But successful graduates emerged with a skill that would serve them for life. They could read and write, calculate and record, draft legal documents and manage accounts. They were qualified to work in temples or palaces, for wealthy merchants, or as independent scribes in the marketplace. They had climbed several rungs up the social ladder, while boys were studying in the tablet house. Girls were typically learning different skills at home. Women in Sumer often managed households, and this was no simple task. A household was an economic unit, producing textiles, preparing food, perhaps brewing beer, managing servants if the family was wealthy enough. A capable household manager needed to be organized, skilled, and shrewd. Many women also ran shops or managed businesses. We have records of women working as tavern keepers, selling beer and food to customers. Others sold textiles they had woven or traded goods in the marketplace. Some managed family businesses, while their husbands traveled on trading expeditions. The line between household management and business management was often blurred, and capable women moved fluidly between these roles. Life in ancient Sumer wasn't all work and no play. Leisure existed, and people found ways to enjoy themselves. One of the most delightful archaeological discoveries is the royal game of your board game found in the royal tombs of that ancient city. The game board is beautiful, inlaid with shell, lapis lazuli, and red limestone in geometric patterns. The rules have been partially reconstructed from ancient tablets. and it turns out to be a racing game, something like an ancestor of backgammon. But this wasn't just a royal pastime. Simpler versions of the game have been found in ordinary homes. People would gather in the evening after the day's work was done and play. They would laugh over good moves and bad luck, enjoy friendly competition, pass the time in pleasant company. The game was popular enough that it spread throughout the ancient Near East and remained popular for thousands of years. Music filled Sumerian life, adding beauty and meaning to both sacred and secular occasions. In the temples, music accompanied rituals and ceremonies. Hymns were sung to the gods, prayers were chanted, festivals were celebrated with instrumental performances. Music helped create the atmosphere of sanctity, connection between the human and divine worlds at banquets. Whether in the palace or in more modest homes, celebrating a wedding or festival, musicians would perform. Music made occasions special, transformed ordinary gatherings into memorable events. We have images from ancient Sumer showing banquet scenes, with musicians playing while diners recline and servants bring food and drink. The instruments themselves were sophisticated and varied. Harps and lyres were particularly important. These weren't simple instruments, but beautifully crafted objects, often decorated with precious materials. The famous lyre from the tomb of Queen Pwabi at Ur has a golden bull's head, its eyes of lapis lazuli, its beard of shell. When archaeologists found it, they found not just an artifact, but evidence of artistic and musical achievement. These stringed instruments could produce complex melodies and harmonies. Players would pluck the strings, creating music that must have been haunting and beautiful. We don't know exactly what Sumerian music sounded like, since musical notation as we know it didn't exist. But we know it was important enough to be depicted in art, described in texts, and honored with the creation of precious instruments. Flutes and reed pipes added their voices to the musical landscape. These wind instruments were simpler to make than harps and lyres, carved from wood or red, and they were probably more common in everyday life. A shepherd might play a flute while watching his flock. A worker might play a simple tune during a break. Music wasn't just for special occasions, but woven into the fabric of daily life. Drums and percussion, instruments kept rhythm, driving the music forward, their beats marking time in rituals and celebrations. Battles and bells added texture and variety. Together, these instruments created a rich soundscape, music that accompanied the Sumerians from birth to death. From morning rituals to evening entertainment. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the sounds of an ancient Sumerian evening. The workday is done. Farmers have returned from the fields. Craftsmen have put away their tools. In homes throughout the city, families gather. Some play board games, moving their pieces across decorated boards, hoping for favorable throws. From a nearby house, you hear the gentle sound of a lyre, someone practicing a melody. Children play in the narrow streets, their voices echoing off mud brick walls. From the temple complex comes the sound of evening hymns, voices raised in praise of the gods. This was life in ancient Sumer, work and rest, duty and pleasure, sacred and secular, all woven together. People worked hard, yes, in fields and workshops, at looms and wheels, but they also played games and made music, enjoyed the company of family and friends, found beauty and joy in their world. They were fully human in all the ways that matter. And as you rest now, separated from them by thousands of years, but connected by the common thread of human experience, you can know that they too looked forward to their leisure time, enjoyed their games and music, and found peace at the end of a long day, just as you do now. Among all the achievements of ancient Sumer, among all the innovations and inventions that flowed from the land between the rivers, perhaps none has had a more profound and lasting impact than the development of writing. Cuneiform writing emerged in the 4th millennium BCE, sometime around 3400 to 3200 BCE, and with it, humanity crossed a threshold. Before writing, everything depended on memory. Knowledge could be preserved only in human minds and passed down through the fragile chain of oral tradition. After writing, knowledge could be fixed, preserved, transmitted across space and time with unprecedented accuracy. The birth of writing wasn't a sudden revelation or the invention of a single genius. It emerged gradually, organically, in response to practical needs. In the growing cities of Sumer, economic life was becoming increasingly complex. Temples managed vast estates with thousands of workers. Merchants engaged in long-distance trade. Agricultural production required careful planning and distribution. Someone needed to keep track of it all. And so, writing began as accounting, as a system for recording transactions and managing resources. The earliest written documents we have are clay tablets covered with simple pictographs, pictures that represented concrete objects. A drawing of a sheep meant sheep. A drawing of a jar meant oil or grain or beer. Numbers were indicated by different impressions in the clay. These early tablets are accounting records, pure and simple. 32 sheep received from Cushons, 7 jars of oil to the temple. They're not literature or philosophy or personal letters. They're receipts and inventories, the mundane paperwork of temple administration. But mundane as they were, they represented something revolutionary. Information recorded outside a human mind, preserved in a form that could outlast any individual life. The medium for this writing was perfectly suited to Mesopotamia. Clay was abundant, free for the taking from the riverbanks. It could be shaped into tablets of any size, from tiny tags no bigger than a postage stamp, to large tablets that could hold extensive texts. While the clay was still soft, marks could be pressed into it with a stylus, originally made from reed. Then the tablet could be dried in the sun or baked in a fire, creating a permanent record that could last for thousands of years. Over time, the writing system evolved. The pictographs became more abstract, simplified for ease and speed of writing. This stylus, when pressed into clay at an angle, created wedge-shaped marks, and the entire system came to be built around these wedges. The word cuneiform comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, by around 3000 BCE. Cuneiform had evolved from simple pictographs into a complex writing system capable of expressing any thought that could be spoken. And once that capability existed, put writing expanded far beyond its original accounting functions. Scribes began to use their skills to record letters, allowing people to communicate across distances. Kings sent messages to other kings. Merchants sent instructions to their agents. Administrators sent reports to their superior. The written word could travel where the writer could not. Writing captured myths and legends that had previously existed only in oral tradition. The old stories, passed down from generation to generation around fires and in temples, were now fixed in clay. They could be copied, shared, preserved. Future generations would know exactly what had been said, and sung. Laws, too, were written down. We've mentioned the law code of Yornamu, but there were others as well. Writing these laws on permanent monuments and tablets meant everyone could know what the law actually said. Justice became more predictable, less dependent on the memory or whim of individual judges. Scribes, those essential keepers of written knowledge, maintained detailed administrative records of everything that happened in temples and palaces. They recorded the arrival of goods, the distribution of rations, the assignment of workers, the performance of rituals. They documented loans and debts, sales and purchases, marriages and divorces. The clay tablets that archaeologists have recovered give us an incredibly detailed picture of Sumerian life, precisely because the scribes were so thorough in their record-keeping. To facilitate their work and to train new scribes, the Sumerians created lexical lists which acted essentially like early dictionaries or encyclopedias. These were long tablets listing words in categories, lists of trees, lists of animals, lists of tools, lists of professions, lists of gods. Some lists were bilingual, showing Sumerian words alongside their equivalents in Akkadian, the Semitic language that would eventually replace Sumerian as the spoken language of Mesopotamia. These lexical lists served multiple purposes. They helped students learn vocabulary. They standardized spelling and usage. They preserved knowledge about the natural world and human culture. And they help us today understand the Sumerian language, because the ancient scribes essentially created reference works that explained their own language to future generations. The Sumerians also developed wisdom literature, texts designed to teach moral behavior and proper conduct. These included proverbs, similar to the biblical book of Proverbs, or the sayings of any culture's wise elders. A loving heart maintains the family. Friendship lasts a day. Kinship endures forever. He who possesses many things is constantly on guard. Other wisdom texts took the form of instructions or advice, often framed as a father teaching his son, or a teacher instructing a student. These texts emphasize the value of education, the importance of hard work, respect for authority, and proper behavior in social situations. Tell reveal what the Sumerians valued, what they hoped to pass on to the next generation. And then there was literature in the fullest sense. Stories told for their beauty and meaning, not just for practical instruction. The greatest of these was the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest works of literature in human history. The story of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, was probably told orally for centuries before it was written down. But once committed to clay tablets, it became fixed, canonical text that would be copied and recopied for over 2,000 years. The epic tells of Gilgamesh's friendship with the wild man Enkidu, their adventures together, Enkidu's death, and Gilgamesh's subsequent quest for immortality. It grapples with profound themes: the meaning of friendship, the inevitability of death, the limits of human power, the value of civilization. When Gilgamesh finally learns that immortality is impossible, that death comes for everyone, even the mightiest king, he returns to Uruk and finds consolation in the lasting works of civilization, the walls and temples that will outlive any individual. The epic is moving and beautiful, and it speaks to universal human concerns. Small wonder that it was so popular throughout the ancient Near East, copied and adapted by many cultures. We're fortunate that so many copies survive, allowing modern scholars to reconstruct the story and share it with new audiences separated from its origin by more than 4,000 years. The language in which all these texts were written, Sumerian itself, is fascinating and somewhat mysterious. Sumerian was a language isolate, which means it has no known relatives. It's not related to the Semitic languages like Akkadian, Hebrew, or Arabic. It's not related to the Indo-European languages like Greek, Latin, or Sanskrit. It stands alone, unconnected to any other known language family. This makes Sumerian challenging to understand. When scholars first began to decipher cuneiform in the 19th century, they started with Akkadian, which they could approach through its relationship to known Semitic languages. Sumerian was much harder, but fortunately, the ancient scribes had created those bilingual lexical lists, Sumerian dictionaries essentially, which provided the key to unlocking the language. What we've learned is that Sumerian was quite different from the languages most of us are familiar with. It was agglutinative, meaning it built up complex words by stringing together many smaller elements. A single Sumerian word might convey what would require a whole phrase in English. The language had no gender for nouns, but it did distinguish between animate and inanimate objects. Its grammar and structure reflected a way of thinking about the world that was, in some ways, alien to us, in other ways, strangely familiar. As the centuries passed and Semitic-speaking peoples became increasingly important in Mesopotamia, Sumerian gradually ceased to be spoken in daily life. By around 2000 BCE, Akkadian had become the common language of the region. Sumerian children no longer learned their ancestral language naturally from their parents, but had to study it in school, much as students today might study Latin or ancient Greek. But remarkably, Sumerian survived as a scholarly and religious language for another 2,000 years. Long after the last native speaker had died, scribes continued to learn Sumerian, to copy Sumerian texts, to compose new works in the ancient tongue. It was the language of the oldest and most sacred texts, the language in which the gods had first been addressed, the language of wisdom and tradition. This parallel is often drawn to Latin in medieval Europe, remaining the language of learning and religion long after it ceased to be anyone's native language. Bore to Sanskrit in India, preserved through religious and scholarly use, apply Sumerians. Survival in this form is a testament to its cultural prestige and to the conservatism of scribal tradition, which valued old knowledge and old ways of expressing it in the tablet houses. Students in the 2nd millennium BCE and even the 1st millennium BCE were still laboriously copying texts in Sumerian, studying grammar that was already ancient, learning a language that hadn't been spoken in the streets for 1,000 years or more. They did this because Sumerian was the language of civilization itself, the tongue in which humanity had first learned to write, and that gave it an authority that mere practical considerations couldn't diminish. As you relax into sleep, imagine a scribe in ancient Uruk pressing his stylus into soft clay, forming those distinctive wedge-shaped marks. Each tablet he creates is a small victory over forgetfulness, a message sent forward through time. Some of those messages were mundane, yes, records of sheep and grain that matter only to historians. But others were profound, laws to govern society, wisdom to guide behavior, stories to illuminate the human condition. Those clay tablets, so many thousands of them, survived when wood rotted, when cloth decayed, when metal corroded. They were buried in the ruins of ancient cities, waiting patiently for millennia, until archaeologists unearthed them and scholars learned once again to read the wedge-shaped marks pressed into their surfaces, then because of those tablets, because the Sumerians invented writing and wrote so much down. We know them better than we know any other ancient people of their era. We can read their letters and laws, their myths and proverbs. We can hear their voices across the vast gulf of time, speaking to us in the wedges and angles of cuneiform script. The epic of Gilgamesh ends with the hero finding peace in the knowledge that his city, his walls, his works will endure. And they have endured in a way. The physical walls of Uruk are ruins now, barely visible bumps in the Iraqi desert. But the words about those walls, the epic that describes them, that survives, clay outlasted stone, writing outlasted everything. Rest now, and perhaps dream of those ancient scribes, bent over their work, preserving knowledge, creating literature, sending messages to the future, messages that we, impossibly distant descendants, can still receive and read and understand. The wedges in the clay still speak, after all these silent centuries. And they tell us that we are not so different from the black-headed people who first learned to write. The ingenuity of the Sumerians extended far beyond writing and social organization. They were practical innovators, people who looked at the challenges of their environment and their lives and created solutions that would echo through the millennia. Among their most significant inventions was the wheel, a device so fundamental to human civilization that we can barely imagine life without it. The wheel appeared in Mesopotamia around 3500 BC, and its impact was immediate and profound. The Sumerians used it for two primary purposes, each revolutionary in its own way. First, there was the potter's wheel, which transformed the ancient craft of pottery. Before the wheel, potters had built vessels by hand, coiling clay or shaping it slowly and laboriously. The potter's wheel allowed them to spin the clay, using centrifugal force and skilled hands to shape vessels quickly and with perfect symmetry. The pottery that emerged from these wheels was smoother, more uniform, more beautiful than what had come before. Production increased dramatically. A skilled potter at a wheel could produce in a day what might have taken a week using older methods. This meant more vessels for storing grain and oil, for serving food and drink, for every purpose that required container. It meant pottery could be produced for trade, becoming a commodity in itself. The second use of the wheel was for transport. Wheeled vehicles, carts, and wagons, pulled by oxen or donkeys, could carry loads far heavier than any pack animal could bear on its back. The flat Mesopotamian plain was perfect for wheeled transport. There were few hills to climb, and roads could be built relatively easily. Goods could move from city to city, from fields to granaries, from workshops to markets, with unprecedented efficiency. These early wheels were solid, cut from planks of wood and fastened together, heavy and sturdy. The spoked wheel, lighter and more efficient, would come later. But even these solid wheels represented a quantum leap in human capability. Distance became less of an obstacle. Trade became easier. The cities of Sumer grew more interconnected, more interdependent. Another innovation that transformed Sumerian life was the plow. Agriculture had been practiced in Mesopotamia for thousands of years before the Sumerians. But it had been hard, back-breaking work, done with simple tools. The plow, pulled by oxen, allowed farmers to break up the soil more deeply, and more quickly than they ever could with hand tools. The result was a dramatic increase in agricultural productivity. Fields could be prepared faster, planted more efficiently, and the deeper plowing meant better crops. The same amount of labor could now work more land and produce more food. This increased surplus supported larger populations, more elaborate cities, greater specialization of labor. The plow didn't just make farming easier. It made civilization more possible. The Sumerians were also mathematical innovators, and their greatest contribution in this area was the development of base 60 mathematics. Most cultures have used base 10 mathematics, probably because we have 10 fingers to count on. But the Sumerians developed a sexagesimal system based on the number 60. Why 60? Scholars have debated this question. 60 has many factors. It can be divided evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes it very convenient for fractions and division, for the kinds of calculations that were important in commerce and administration. Whatever the reason, the Sumerians committed to this system and used it with great sophistication. And remarkably, we still use their base 60 system today. Thousands of years later, every time we look at a clock, the division of the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds comes directly from Sumerian mathematics. When we say 3:30 or 4:45, we're using fractional divisions that the Sumerians would have found perfectly natural. The day itself, divided into 24 hours, reflects this Sumerian heritage. Though the Sumerians actually divided the day and night each into 12 hours, with the length of an hour varying by season. But the fundamental structure, the way we organize time into nested divisions of 60, that's a gift from ancient Sumer that we use so constantly we barely notice it. The Sumerians also developed geometry, the mathematics of space and shape. This wasn't abstract theoretical mathematics pursued for its own sake. It was practical knowledge needed for measuring fields and determining property boundaries, when land was bought or sold, when property lines were disputed. Clean irrigation canals needed to be planned. Geometry provided the tools. Scribes learned to calculate the area of rectangular fields, to determine how much seed would be needed for planting, how much harvest to expect, how much tax was owed. They could work with triangular plots and more irregular shapes. Mathematical tablets show problems and solutions, teaching students how to apply geometric principles to real-world situations. In a society where wealth was largely based on land, where agriculture was the foundation of everything, this mathematical knowledge was powerful and valuable. The ability to measure accurately, to calculate fairly, to document precisely. These were skills that made civilization work. Economic life in Sumer required standards of value, ways of measuring wealth and facilitating exchange. In a world before coined money, two commodities served as standards: silver and barley. Silver, precious and relatively rare, was used for larger transactions and as a store of value. Barley, the staple grain of Mesopotamian agriculture, was used for smaller everyday transactions and for calculating wages and rations. Prices might be quoted in silver shekels, a unit of weight rather than a coin. A shekel was about 8 grams of silver. Contracts specified payment in silver, though the actual transaction might involve other goods whose value was calculated in silver equivalents. Barley served a similar function at a more accessible level. Workers might be paid in barley rations, and small purchases might be made with barley as the medium of exchange. This dual standard reflects the practical realities of Sumerian economics. Not everyone had silver or needed to deal in such valuable amounts, but everyone needed grain, understood its value, could use it directly or trade it easily. The system worked, facilitating the complex web of exchanges that urban life required. Yet, for all their achievements, the Sumerians faced significant resource constraints. The Mesopotamian plain provided abundant clay, reed, and agricultural products, but it lacked three crucial materials: stone, timber, and metals. There was no stone for building monuments or grinding grain. There were no forests to provide timber for construction or furniture. There were no metal ores to make tools, weapons, and ornaments. This scarcity drove one of the most important aspects of Sumerian civilization: long-distance trade. If Sumer lacked essential resources, then those resources would have to come from elsewhere. And so Sumerian traders traveled far and wide, establishing trade networks that stretched across the ancient Near East and beyond. To the north and west lay Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, source of silver and timber. To the east were the Zagros Mountains of Iran, providing stone, timber, and various minerals. Further east still was the Indus Valley in modern Pakistan and northwest India, a distant civilization with its own cities and culture, offering carnelian beads, ivory, and exotic goods. Copper came from Megan, probably modern Oman, shipped across the Persian Gulf to the ports of southern Mesopotamia. Tin, necessary for making bronze when alloyed with copper, came from even more distant sources, possibly Afghanistan or Central Asia. Lapis lazuli, that beautiful deep blue stone so prized by the Sumerians, made an even longer journey from mines in Afghanistan. These trade routes were the arteries of Sumerian civilization, bringing in the materials that the land between the rivers couldn't provide. Merchants organized caravans and ships, sent agents to distant lands, negotiated with foreign traders, and brought back the goods that made Sumerian life possible. In exchange, they exported the surplus of Mesopotamia, textiles, especially fine woolens, grain when harvests were good, manufactured goods made by Sumerian craftsmen, to facilitate trade and secure transactions. The Sumerians developed cylinder seals, small carved cylinders of stone that could be rolled across soft clay to leave a distinctive impression. Each seal was unique, carved with intricate designs, often depicting religious scenes, mythological creatures, or the owner's name and titles. These seals acted as signatures and security devices. When a merchant sealed a container or a document, the unique impression of his seal verified the contents and the authenticity of the transaction. Breaking a seal without authorization was a serious offense. The seal impression was proof of who had been involved, what had been agreed to, and that the container or document hadn't been tampered with. Cylinder seals were personal items, often quite beautiful, sometimes quite valuable depending on the stone and skill of the carving. People wore them on cords around their necks or wrists, keeping them always at hand. When archaeologists find a cylinder seal in a grave, they know they've found someone of at least moderate status, someone who participated in the economic life of their city in a meaningful way. The variety and artistry of surviving cylinder seals is remarkable. Some are tiny, carved from ordinary stone with simple designs. Others are larger, carved from precious lapis lazuli or carnelian with exquisite detail showing gods, heroes, and elaborate scenes. Each one is a small work of art, and collectively they provide a window into Sumerian religious beliefs, artistic sensibilities, and daily concerns. As you drift toward sleep, imagine a Sumerian merchant preparing for a long journey. He checks his goods, seals the containers with his cylinder seal, rolled carefully across the clay to leave its unmistakable mark. He calculates the value of his cargo in silver shekels and barley measures, using the base 60 mathematics that structure his world. His cart, mounted on solid wooden wheels, is pulled by patient oxen, ready for the long road ahead. He travels to obtain what his city needs: timber from distant mountains to build, stone to grind grain, copper and tin to make tools and weapons. The journey is dangerous, the distances vast, but the need is real and the profit potential significant. He carries with him textiles woven in his city, perhaps pottery made on fast-spinning wheels, products of Sumerian skill and industry to trade for foreign goods. Meanwhile, back in the city, farmer's guide plows through fields made fertile by irrigation, turning the soil for planting, using ox power and bronze plowshares to prepare for another harvest. Scribes in the temple calculate areas of fields, measuring with geometric precision, recording everything in their distinctive wedge-shaped script. The potter's wheel spins, the seal is rolled, time is measured in hours and minutes of 60, and the innovations of ancient Sumer make all of it possible. These practical achievements, these tools and techniques and systems, weren't merely clever inventions. They were the foundations on which Sumerian civilization rested. The wheel and plow increased productivity. Mathematics brought order and precision. Trade networks overcame resource limitations. Pills secured transactions and built trust across distances. Rest peacefully now, and appreciate that so much of what we take for granted in our modern world has roots that extend back to ancient Sumer. Every time you check the time, you're using Sumerian mathematics, the fundamental technologies of civilization, pre-refined and elaborated over millennia, but recognizably descended from Sumerian innovations, surround us still. For all their achievements in art and literature, mathematics and trade, the Sumerians were not a peaceful people living in perpetual harmony. The city-states of Sumer, each fiercely independent and proud, frequently came into conflict with one another. These weren't abstract diplomatic disagreements settled through negotiation. They were real wars, fought with organized armies, resulting in death and destruction, conquest and defeat. The primary causes of conflict were practical and immediate: water and land. In the flat, arid landscape of southern Mesopotamia, these weren't merely resources, they were survival itself. Control of irrigation canals meant the difference between prosperity and famine. A city that could divert water to its own fields while denying it to a rival held enormous power. Border disputes over agricultural land were similarly consequential, because land meant food, and food meant everything. Among all the rivalries between Sumerian city-states, perhaps none was more famous or more bitter than the conflict between Lagash and Amma. These two cities, neighboring each other in the Mesopotamian plain, fought repeatedly over a fertile tract of land called the Gwed. This disputed territory lay between the two cities, and both claimed it as rightfully theirs, supposedly granted to them by the gods themselves. The conflict between Lagash and Amma dragged on for generations, flaring up repeatedly in cycles of war and uneasy peace. Kings rose and fell, but the fundamental dispute remained. Each side had its grievances, its claims to justice, its determination not to yield what it believed was rightfully its own. It's a pattern familiar from conflicts throughout human history, neighbors fighting over borders, each convinced of the righteousness of their cause. We know about this conflict in unusual detail because of a remarkable artifact called the Stele of the Vultures. This monument, erected by King of Lagash around 2450 BC, celebrates his victory over Amma. It's one of the earliest detailed records of warfare that we possess, and it provides a vivid glimpse into how the Sumerians fought and how they commemorated their victories. The stele gets its modern name from one of its most striking images: vultures carrying away the severed heads of enemy soldiers. It's a brutal image, unflinching in its depiction of warfare's reality. But the stele shows more than just the aftermath of battle. It depicts organized military formations, soldiers in tight ranks holding spears and large rectangular shields, advancing in disciplined order. This wasn't a chaotic melee of individual warriors. The Sumerian armies were organized, disciplined forces. Soldiers trained together, fought in formation, followed their commanders' orders. They wore helmets for protection, carried shields that could overlap to form a defensive wall, wielded spears that could strike from behind that wall. This was warfare as a collective enterprise, requiring coordination and discipline. The Sumerians also employed battle carts, early four-wheeled vehicles pulled by donkeys or onagers, those wild asses native to the region. These weren't chariots in the later sense. They were heavy, solid-wheeled carts that couldn't turn quickly or maneuver with agility, but they could carry warriors into battle, perhaps provide a mobile platform for spear throwers or commanders, and certainly had psychological impact, bearing down on an enemy line with the thunder of hooves and wheels. The stele of the vultures also shows the religious dimension of warfare. On one side, it depicts the god Ninjasu, patron deity of Lagash, holding a net full of captured enemies. The message was clear. This wasn't just a human conflict, but a divine judgment. The gods themselves had decided the outcome. Lagash had prevailed because Ninjasu had fought for them. The enemy of Lagash was the enemy of the gods. This intertwining of religion and warfare was typical of the ancient world. Wars were fought not just for practical gains, but as holy causes. Treaties invoked the gods as witnesses and guarantors. Victory was divine favor made manifest. Defeat suggested that the gods had withdrawn their protections, perhaps because of some failing or sin. The conflict between Lagash and Umma, like so many wars, ultimately resolved nothing permanently. Umma would recover. The disputed land would change hands again. New grievances would arise. The cycle of conflict would continue until larger forces reshaped the political landscape of Mesopotamia entirely. But beyond the immediate conflicts between city-states, Sumer faced a more insidious and ultimately more devastating challenge: environmental degradation. The very irrigation systems that had made Sumerian civilization possible were slowly poisoning the land that sustained it. The problem was soil salinization, the buildup of salt in the soil. When water evaporates in the hot Mesopotamian climate, it leaves behind whatever minerals it contained. In a naturally watered field, rain would wash these salts away. But in irrigated fields, water was being added constantly, evaporating constantly, and the salts accumulated year after year, generation after generation. Salt is deadly to most crops. As the soil became increasingly saline, agricultural yields began to decline. Fields that once produced abundant harvests grew less productive. Some areas had to be abandoned entirely as the salt levels became too high for any crops to grow. The Sumerians tried various solutions: fields fallow, switching to more salt-tolerant crops like barley instead of wheat. But the fundamental problem persisted. We can track this decline in ancient records. Tablets documenting agricultural production show yields decreasing over time. References to salt-damaged land become more common. The crisis was slow-moving, taking centuries to fully develop, but it was inexorable. The very success of Sumerian irrigation, pushed to support ever larger urban populations, was undermining the agricultural base that sustained everything. The declining productivity of southern Mesopotamia had profound political implications. As the south weakened, power shifted northward to regions less affected by sun. Cities in Akkad, the region north of Sumer, grew more powerful. They had access to adequate water, their soil was less damaged, and they were positioned to control trade routes running through Mesopotamia. Around 2334 BC, Sargon of Akkad conquered the Sumerian city-states and united all of Mesopotamia under his rule, creating what is often considered the world's first empire. This marked a turning point. Sumer would never again be independent. The age of the autonomous Sumerian city-states was ending, though Sumerian culture, language, and influence would continue for centuries to come. Over the following centuries, power continued to shift. New peoples moved into Mesopotamia, bringing new languages and new ways. The Amorites established the first dynasty of Babylon. The Kassites ruled for centuries. Later came the Assyrians and then the Persians. The political landscape of Mesopotamia was repeatedly transformed. But remarkably, through all these changes, later peoples remembered Sumer with reverence and nostalgia. To the Babylonians and Assyrians who came after, Sumer was a golden age. the time when civilization was young and the gods walked closer to the earth. They continued to copy Sumerian texts, to study the Sumerian language in their schools, to claim connection to the glories of the Sumerian past, kings of Babylon and Assyria, speaking Akkadian and worshipping under Akkadian names, still honored the old Sumerian deities. They restored ancient Sumerian temples, presented themselves as the rightful successors to Sumerian kings, and looked back to Sumer as the source of all wisdom and learning. It was similar to how medieval Europeans looked back to classical Greece and Rome, or how later Islamic civilization treasured and preserved ancient knowledge. The idea of Sumer as a golden age wasn't entirely myth. The Sumerians had been innovators, the first to create true cities, the inventors of writing, the developers of sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, the authors of humanity's earliest literature. Their achievements were real and remarkable, but the memory also served a purpose for later peoples, providing legitimacy, connecting them to a glorious past, giving them a heritage to claim and honor. As you drift into sleep, picture the Guadena that disputed borderland between Lagash and Oma, sometimes green with crops, sometimes trampled by armies, always contested. Picture the formations of Sumerian soldiers, shields locked together, spears bristling, advancing to the beat of drums and the invocations of priests calling on the gods for victory. Picture the slower, quieter tragedy of the salinizing fields, the white crust of salt beginning to show in the soil, the crops growing thinner each year, the worried discussions of farmers and priests trying to understand why the land was failing them. Picture the canals that had brought life to the desert, now bringing, slowly and invisibly, the means of decline, and picture the scribes of later ages, Babylonian students bent over their tablets, laboriously copying ancient Sumerian hymns and stories, preserving a language no longer spoken, honoring a civilization that had passed into history but refused to be forgotten. The memory of Sumer, golden and glorious, would outlast Sumer itself. The cities fell, the fields returned to desert, the canals silted up and vanished. But the legacy remained. The wheel still turned. The hours still divided into 60 minutes. The Epic of Gilgamesh still told its story of friendship and mortality, the laws and wisdom, the mathematics and astronomy, the very idea of civilization itself, all bore the mark of Sumer. Every ending is also a transformation. Sumer ended as an independent civilization, but it lived on in the cultures that followed, absorbed and honored, studied and revered. The black-headed people left the stage of history, but the stage itself, the very concept of urban civilization with its writing and laws, its temples and schools, its arts and sciences, that was Sumer's gift to all who came after. Rest peacefully now, knowing that some things endure even through decline and fall. Ideas outlast cities. Knowledge transcends the civilizations that create it. Bend the achievements of the Sumerians, won through centuries of effort in the difficult land between the rivers, enriched all of human history and continue to shape our world today. Around the year 2334 BC, a figure emerged who would transform the political landscape of Mesopotamia forever. His name was Sargon, and he came from the city of Akkad, a place whose exact location remains unknown to us today. Lost somewhere in the sands of central Mesopotamia, Sargon's origins were humble, or so the legends tell us. Later texts describe him as a foundling, discovered as a baby in a basket floating on a river, raised by a gardener, favored by the goddess Ishtar. Whether these stories are true or mythologized versions of a more mundane reality, we cannot know. But what we do know is that this man would create something unprecedented in human history. Sargon rose to power in a world of competing city-states, each jealously guarding its independence. By his time, one man had managed to dominate many of these cities, Lugal-Geziksi, king of Oma, who had conquered numerous Sumerian cities and proclaimed himself king of the land. Lugal-Geziksi seemed poised to create a unified state, but his rule was resented, his control contested. The proud cities of Sumer did not submit icily to outside authority. Sargon challenged Lugal-Geziksi and defeated him in battle. The victory was decisive. According to Sargon's own inscriptions, he captured Lugal-Geziksi, brought him to Nippur in a neckstock, and displayed him at the gate of the temple of Enlil, the supreme god. It was a public humiliation, a demonstration of power, a message to all who might resist. The old order was finished. A new one had begun. But Sargon didn't stop with victory over Lugal-Geziksi. He continued his campaigns, conquering city after city, until all of Sumer was under his control. And then he kept going, north into Akkad, west toward Syria and the Mediterranean coast, east into the mountains of Iran. His armies marched farther than any Mesopotamian force had marched before, bringing distant lands under his authority. What Sargon created was fundamentally different from what had come before. This wasn't a city-state that had grown large. It wasn't a coalition of allied cities. It wasn't even one city-state conquering its immediate neighbors. This was Akkad, the first territorial empire, a single state that controlled a vast area stretching from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the Iranian plateau in the east, from the mountains of Anatolia in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. The scale was unprecedented. Hundreds of miles separated the empire's extremes. Dozens of different peoples, speaking different languages, following different customs, were now all subjects of the same king. This was empire in the truest sense, the unification of diverse territories under a single centralized authority. The Akkadians themselves were a Semitic-speaking people, related linguistically to peoples throughout the ancient Near East. Their language, Akkadian, was very different from Sumerian, where Sumerian was a language isolate, standing alone with no known relatives. Akkadian belonged to the great Semitic language family that would eventually include Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, and many others. The Akkadians had long lived alongside the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. sometimes in separate settlements, sometimes intermingled in the same cities. They had absorbed much Sumerian culture, worshipped the same gods under different names, participated in the same urban civilization, but they maintained their own language and identity, and now, under Akkad, that identity was ascendant. One of the great advantages the Akkadians had was that they could build on Sumerian achievements rather than starting from scratch. Most importantly, they adapted Sumerian cuneiform writing to represent their own language. This wasn't a simple or obvious process. Cuneiform had been developed for Sumerian, a language with very different structure and sounds. Making it work for Akkadian required ingenuity and creativity. The scribes managed it by using cuneiform signs in multiple ways. Some signs represented whole words, just as they had in Sumerian. Others were adapted to represent syllables in Akkadian. Still others were used as determinatives, markers that indicated what category of thing a word referred to. The result was a complex system, more complicated than either pure Sumerian or a purely phonetic script would have been. But it worked, and it allowed Akkadian to be written with the established, prestigious medium of cuneiform on clay tablets. As the Akkadian Empire expanded, so did the use of the Akkadian language. It became the language of imperial administration, of diplomacy, of commerce across wide regions. In the centuries after Sargon, Akkadian would become the diplomatic language of the entire ancient Near East. Kings in Egypt and Anatolia, in Syria and Canaan, would conduct their correspondence in Akkadian, even when both parties spoke other languages natively. This linguistic dominance would last for well over 1,000 years. The famous Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and various Near Eastern kingdoms from the 14th century BCE, were written in Akkadian, nearly a millennium after Sargon. Akkadian had become the international language of its age, much as Latin would be in medieval Europe or English is in much of the world today. But Sargon's empire wasn't just about linguistic and cultural spread. It involved a fundamental reorganization of how Mesopotamia was governed. The old system of autonomous city-states, each with its own king or ruler, each managing its own affairs, was replaced with a centralized bureaucracy answerable to the king in Akkad. Sargon appointed his own officials to govern conquered cities. He installed his daughter, Enhedwanyas, the poet we mentioned earlier, as high priestess in Ur, ensuring his family's control over that crucial religious center. He standardized weights and measures across his empire, making trade and taxation more efficient. He established a standing army, professional soldiers loyal to him personally rather than to individual cities. This centralization had advantages. It allowed for coordinated responses to threats, more efficient collection and redistribution of resources, and greater security along trade routes. The empire could undertake projects no single city-state could manage alone. It could defend itself against external threats more effectively than divided cities could. But centralization also bred resentment. The proud cities of Sumer had valued their independence for centuries, being governed by appointees from Akkad, paying taxes to support a distant king. Following standardized imperial regulations, all of this chafed. The traditions of local autonomy, of each city managing its own affairs under its patron deity, these were deeply rooted. They didn't disappear just because Sargon had conquered the cities. Revolts broke out repeatedly. Sargon himself claimed to have fought 34 battles to maintain his empire. His successors faced constant challenges, cities attempting to reassert their independence, subject peoples trying to break free. Holding the empire together required constant military action and political maneuvering. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, dealt with these challenges by going even further than his grandfather had. He declared himself divine, a god in his own lifetime, and demanded worship as such. This was unprecedented. Mesopotamian kings had always been the representatives of the gods, ruling with divine approval. But they had been mortals, not deities themselves. Naram-Sin broke this tradition, perhaps hoping that divine status would make his authority unquestionable. The empire Sargon founded lasted for about 200 years, a respectable span, though not eternal. Around 2154 BCE, it collapsed under the combined pressures of internal rebellion and external invasion. The Gushans mountain people from the Zagros swept down into Mesopotamia. The centralized authority fractured. The cities reasserted their independence. The Akkadian Empire was finished, but its legacy endured. The idea of empire, of unifying diverse territories under a single authority, had been born. Future rulers would look back to Sargon as a model. The pattern he established, military conquest followed by administrative consolidation. The appointment of loyal officials, the standardization of systems across diverse regions would be repeated by empire builders throughout history. And the Akkadian language, promoted and spread by the empire, would long outlast it. Even as political power fragmented, Akkadian remained the common language of Mesopotamia, the language of administration and scholarship, of trade and diplomacy. Sumerian would survive only as a scholarly tongue, while Akkadian would be spoken, written for more than 2,000 years, evolving into various dialects, but maintaining its essential character. As you drift towards sleep, imagine Sargon in his palace in Akkad, that lost city we've never found. Imagine him receiving reports from his officials scattered across his vast empire. From the Mediterranean coast, where his soldiers have washed, put their weapons in the sea, to the mountains of Iran, where garrisons guard the eastern frontier. Imagine the clay tablets arriving daily, written in the wedge-shaped script adapted to his language, bearing news of harvests and rebellions, taxes collected and threats emerging. Picture Enheduanna, the king's daughter, serving as high priestess, composing her hymns to Inanna in the quiet of the temple, balancing her religious duties with her political role as her father's representative. She is both poet and politician, priestess and princess, navigating the complex world of Akkadian imperialism with grace and intelligence. Picture the soldiers of Akkad, professional warriors rather than citizen militias, training together, marching together, fighting in distant lands far from home, bound together by loyalty to their king and to each other. They are the enforcers of unity, the means by which Sargon's will is imposed across hundreds of miles. And picture the bureaucrats, the scribes and administrators who make the empire actually function, who collect the taxes and distribute the rations, who record the transactions and maintain the archives, who translate Sargon's commands into the daily realities of governance across diverse peoples and places. The Akkadian Empire was both an ending and a beginning. It ended the era of independent Sumerian city-states, that distinctive political landscape that had existed for over 1,000 years. But it began something new, the age of empires, of unified states spanning vast territories, of centralized bureaucracies managing complex systems, of imperial languages spreading across cultures. Sargon's personal story, rising from obscurity to rule an empire, has echoed through history as an archetype, a pattern repeated or imagined in countless other narratives. Whether the details of his early life are true or legendary hardly matters. What matters is what he achieved, the new political form he created. The precedent he established doth rest now. And know that the world Sargon made, for all its flaws and brutalities, for all the rebellions it provoked and the traditions it disrupted, was a necessary step in human political development. The empire was born in Akkad, and it would become one of the dominant political forms for millennia to come, for better and for worse, shaping the destinies of countless peoples from that day to this. The Akkadian Empire wasn't maintained through goodwill or voluntary cooperation. It was a creation of political will, enforced through systematic administration and military power. At the heart of this system were the appointed governors, officials sent out from the imperial center to rule the conquered cities and territories in the king's name. These governors replaced the traditional local rulers, the kings and councils who had governed Sumerian cities for generations. They were not chosen from among the local elite, people with roots in the communities they governed. Instead, they were outsiders, loyal to the Akkadian king, dependent on his favor for their positions, and accountable only to him. This was deliberate policy. A governor from Akkad ruling a Sumerian city had no local power base, no ancient family connections that might encourage independence. His authority came entirely from the king, and his loyalty was therefore reliable. The governor's primary responsibilities were maintaining order, ensuring imperial policies were followed, and, above all, collecting taxes. Taxation was the lifeblood of the empire, the means by which resources from diverse territories could be concentrated and redistributed according to imperial priorities. Without efficient tax collection, the empire couldn't function. Taxes in the Akkadian Empire, as in Sumer before it, were collected not in money but in kind, grain, livestock, and labor. Farmers owed a portion of their harvest, delivered to imperial granaries. Herders owed animals from their flocks, and all subjects owed corvée labor. a certain number of days each year working on imperial projects. This grain flowed into the granaries and was then redistributed. Some fed the standing army and the bureaucracy. Some supported the royal household and the temples. Some was held in reserve against famine or emergency. The system was ancient, predating the empire, but the Akkadians systematized it and operated it on a much larger scale than any single city-state ever had. Livestock taxation worked similarly. Sheep and goats, cattle and donkeys were collected and then redistributed. Some went to feed soldiers and workers. Some were used for sacrifices in the temples. Some were traded for goods the empire needed. The bureaucracy tracked it all meticulously on clay tablets, maintaining records of what was owed, what was collected, what was distributed. The labor tax was perhaps the most burdensome. Men were required to work on imperial projects for a certain number of days each year, building canals or roads, constructing public buildings, maintaining fortifications. This labor was in addition to their regular work supporting their own families. It was a significant burden, but it was how ancient states accomplished large-scale projects without a monetary economy to pay wages. The Akkadian standing army was one of the primary beneficiaries of this tax system. Unlike the earlier city-state militias, which had been composed of citizens who farmed during peacetime and fought when needed, the Akkadian army was professional. These were full-time soldiers, trained and equipped at imperial expense, ready to march at the king's command. And march they did constantly. The empire campaigned year after year, sometimes to suppress rebellions, sometimes to expand into new territories, sometimes simply to demonstrate power and collect tribute. Military force was essential to maintaining the empire. Without the constant threat of military intervention, subject peoples would have reasserted their independence. The army was the ultimate argument for imperial authority. These soldiers were better equipped than earlier warriors had been. Bronze metallurgy had improved significantly by the Akkadian period, allowing for stronger, sharper weapons. Bronze spears and axes, bronze helmets and armor gave Akkadian soldiers advantages over less well-equipped opponents. The empire's control of trade routes and resources meant it could afford to equip its army with the best available technology. The standing army also served as a tool of social mobility. Much as armies have throughout history, a talented soldier could rise through the ranks, gaining wealth and status that would have been unattainable in civilian life. Veterans were sometimes granted land or administrative positions. Military service became a pathway to advancement, creating a class of people whose fortunes were tied directly to the empire's success. At the apex of this whole system stood the king, and under Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, the nature of kingship itself transformed. Naram-Sin wasn't content to be merely the most powerful human, ruling with divine approval. He declared himself divine, a god walking the earth, worthy of worship in his own right. This was revolutionary and shocking. In the Mesopotamian worldview, humans and gods occupied separate spheres. Kings kings were important. Yes, chosen by the gods to rule, but they were mortal, subject to death and fate like all human. Naram-Sin shattered this distinction. He added the divine determinative to his name when it was written, the cuneiform sign that indicated a god. He built temples where he himself was worshipped. He claimed not just to rule with divine approval, but to be divine. Himself, the most visible symbol of this claim was the horned helmet. In Mesopotamian art, gods were depicted wearing distinctive horned crowns or helmets, the horns indicating their divine status. No mortal, no matter how powerful, wore such headgear, but Naram-Sin did. On monuments and seals, he appears wearing the horned helmet, making his claim to divinity unmistakable and public. We can only imagine how this was received. For some, perhaps it made sense. Naram-Sin ruled an empire vaster than anyone had imagined possible. He had defeated all enemies, suppressed all rebellions, extended Akkad's power to unimaginable distances. Perhaps such achievements did require divine power. Perhaps he truly was more than mortal. For others, it must have seemed like hubris, a dangerous overstepping of human bounds. Later Mesopotamian tradition suggested that Naram-Sin's self-deification angered the gods and led to the empire's eventual downfall. Whether this was genuine belief or simply a narrative created after the fact to explain the empire's collapse, it reveals unease with the concept of a human claiming godhood. Victory stele, monuments commemorating military triumphs, became important tools of propaganda during the Akkadian period. These weren't merely records, but powerful statements of royal power and divine favor. The most famous is the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, a beautiful carved stone monument showing the king, larger than life and wearing his horned helmet, climbing a mountain as his enemies fall before him. Above him shine the stars, symbols of the gods, watching and approving. The composition is dynamic and powerful. Naram-Sin strides upward confidently, his foot literally on a fallen enemy, his spear ready, his posture commanding. His soldiers follow behind and below him, smaller in scale, emphasizing his supremacy. The defeated enemies tumbled down the mountainside, broken and scattered, its propaganda in stone, designed to communicate unambiguous messages about the king's power and the futility of resistance. The art of the Akkadian period generally became more dynamic and realistic than earlier Sumerian art had been. Sumerian art had been somewhat static and formal, emphasizing order and hierarchy through rigid compositions. Akkadian art showed movement, emotion, individuality. Faces became more distinctive, poses more natural, compositions more dramatic. This shift in artistic style reflected the changing nature of power in Mesopotamia. The Akkadian kings were conquerors, warriors, empire builders. Their art emphasized action and achievement, personal glory and military might. Where Sumerian art had celebrated the eternal order of the city and its gods, Akkadian art celebrated the dynamic power of the king and his victories. Bronze metallurgy advanced significantly during this period, improving not just weapons but also artistic production. Bronze statues could be larger and more detailed than stone carvings, cast in pieces and assembled, allowing for complex poses and fine details. The bronze workers of Akkad were highly skilled, creating works that were both functional and beautiful. A bronze helmet of this period survives, possibly belonging to a king, hammered from a single sheet of bronze and decorated with elaborate relief work showing hair styled in intricate patterns. It's both a protective piece of military equipment and a work of art, demonstrating the high level of craftsmanship achieved by Akkadian metalworkers. Bronze tools were stronger and held edges better than copper, making them more effective for both war and work. Bronze weapons could penetrate armor more easily, could be sharpened more keenly, could withstand the impacts of battle without bending or breaking as readily. This technological advantage helped Akkadian armies dominate their opponents. The improved bronze technology also benefited agriculture and craft production. Bronze plowshares were more durable and effective than earlier tools. Bronze axes could fell trees more efficiently. Bronze chisels allowed more precise stonework. Bend across the empire. The availability of better tools increased productivity and quality of work. As you relax and prepare for sleep, picture Naram-Sin standing atop his mountain on the victory stele, divine horns on his helmet, stars shining above, enemies scattered below. Picture the blend of pride and audacity in claiming godhood, the supreme confidence, or perhaps desperation, that would lead a king to cross that ancient boundary between mortal and divine. Picture the governors in distant cities, far from home, managing the daily business of empire, collecting taxes in grain and animals, organizing labor crews, reporting to the distant king in Akkad. Picture the clay tablets accumulating in archives, thousands upon thousands of them, recording every transaction, every shipment of grain, every day of labor owed and performed. Picture the standing army on campaign, bronze weapons gleaming in the sun, marching through mountains and across plains, bringing distant peoples under imperial control, or suppressing rebellions among those already conquered. Picture the bronze workers in their workshops, hammering and casting, creating weapons for war and statues for temples, advancing their craft, perfecting their techniques. The Akkadian system was efficient and effective in its way, but it was also rigid and demanding. It concentrated power and resources, enabling great projects and military campaigns. But it also created resentments and tensions. The weight of empire pressed down on subject peoples, who remembered their independence and chafed under foreign governors and imperial taxes. Naram-Sin's claim to divinity was perhaps the logical conclusion of imperial ideology, the ultimate assertion of the king's supremacy. If the king was not just the most powerful human, but actually divine, then resistance became not just rebellion, but sacrilege, not just political opposition, but cosmic wrongness. It was a powerful claim, but also a dangerous one, setting standards that no mortal, however powerful, could truly meet. The more absolute it becomes, the more unstable it may be. The higher the claims, the harder the eventual fall. Not ruled an empire vaster than his grandfather had dreamed, wore the horns of the gods, commanded armies across half the known world. And yet, within generations, the empire he ruled would crumble, and later ages would see his self-deification, not as justified confidence, but as the hubris that brought divine punishment. The Akkadian Empire fell, but bronze metallurgy continued. By artistic innovations endured, and the model of empire, for better or worse, became a permanent part of human political imagination. The Akkadian conquest of Sumer could have meant the end of Sumerian culture, the obliteration of centuries of tradition beneath the weight of imperial power. History is full of such erasures. Conquered peoples whose languages and customs vanished, absorbed into the culture of their conquerors. But that's not what happened in Mesopotamia. Instead, something more subtle and more interesting occurred. A cultural fusion, a blending of Sumerian and Akkadian traditions that enriched both. At the heart of this fusion was religion, that most fundamental aspect of ancient life. The Akkadians didn't impose their own gods and reject the Sumerian deities. Instead, they absorbed the Sumerian gods into their own religious system, creating equivalences and correspondences that allowed both traditions to coexist and merge. The process was aided by the fact that the Akkadians had long lived alongside Sumerians and had already been influenced by Sumerian religion. They worshipped many of the same deities, just under different names. Now, with political unification, the religious syncretism became more complete and systematic. Inanna, the great Sumerian goddess of love and war, became Ishtar in Akkadian. The name changed, but the essential character remained. Ishtar was still the passionate, fierce goddess, still associated with the morning and evening star, still the patron of both lovers and warriors. Hymns composed to Inanna could be adapted for Ishtar with little more than a name change. Enlil, the Sumerian king of the gods, was equated with the Akkadian Elil, pronounced almost identically. Enki, the wise god of the fresh waters, became Ea. Utu, the sun god, became Shamash. Nanna, the moon god, became Sin. On and on the correspondences went, deity by deity, building a unified pantheon that drew on both traditions. This wasn't a cold administrative decision, but a living, evolving process. Priests who served these gods spoke both languages, maintained temples with centuries of Sumerian tradition, but also adapted to new political realities. A temple to Inanna Ishtar could honor the goddess under both names, performing ancient Sumerian rituals while also acknowledging Akkadian prayers and offerings. The result was a religious system richer than either culture alone might have produced. Ishtar inherited not just Inanna's attributes, but also accumulated new stories, new aspects, drawing on Semitic traditions as well as Sumerian ones. The merged deity was more complex, more multifaceted than either source alone. This religious fusion required linguistic flexibility, and so bilingualism spread among the educated classes, especially among scribes. A scribe in the Akkadian Empire needed to know both Sumerian and Akkadian. Administrative documents might be in Akkadian, but religious texts were often in Sumerian. Legal precedents drew on both traditions. Literature existed in both languages and increasingly in bilingual versions. The schools where scribes were trained adapted to this reality. Students learned both languages, studying Sumerian as the ancient, prestigious language of religion and high culture, and Akkadian as the living, practical language of administration and daily life. It was similar to how medieval European scholars learned both Latin and their native vernacular, or how educated people in many cultures have maintained knowledge of both classical and contemporary languages. This bilingual education meant that Sumerian literature was preserved even as Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language. The great works of Sumerian literature, the myths and hymns and wisdom texts, didn't disappear. Instead, they were copied, translated, and adapted by Akkadian scribes who valued them as classics, as foundational texts of their shared civilization. Some texts were preserved in their original Sumerian, copied again and again by students learning the ancient language. Others were translated into Akkadian, making them accessible to those less proficient in Sumerian. Still others were created in bilingual editions, with Sumerian and Akkadian versions side by side, allowing readers to compare and study both. This preservation effort was monumental and essential. Without it, we would know far less about Sumerian culture and thought. The Akkadian scribes, by valuing and maintaining Sumerian literary traditions, ensured that these ancient texts would survive for millennia, eventually to be recovered by modern archaeologists and deciphered by modern scholars. One figure stands out as exemplifying this cultural bridge: Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon, high priestess of the moon god Atiodwar, and the world's first known author by name. Enheduanna wrote hymns that bridged both cultures, composing in Sumerian by serving an Akkadian king, honoring traditional Sumerian deities while advancing her father's imperial agenda. Her most famous work, a cycle of hymns to Inanna, Ishtar, is written in Sumerian, but shows the influence of the new political order. The hymns praise the goddess in traditional terms, but also connect her power to the political unification achieved by Enheduanna presents Inanna as a goddess who transcends individual cities, whose power spans the entire empire, whose will is expressed through Sargon's conquests. Its sophisticated theological and political thinking, presented in beautiful poetry. Enheduanna was clearly educated in traditional Sumerian learning, but she used that learning to serve new purposes, to articulate a vision of divine support for imperial unity. She was both preserving tradition and transforming it, both honoring the past and serving the present. And remarkably, she signed her name to her work. This was unusual for the time. Most Sumerian and Akkadian literature was anonymous, the author's identity lost or simply not considered important. But Enheduanna wanted to be remembered, and she was. Her name appears in her works, and later scribes continued to copy them, acknowledging her authorship, preserving her memory along with her poetry. The temples themselves, those great centers of religious and economic life, continued their Sumerian rituals under Akkadian rule. Be daily offerings to the gods, the great festivals that marked the year, the elaborate ceremonies that had been performed for centuries. None of this stopped when Sargon conquered Sumer. The temples were too important, too deeply woven into the fabric of society to be disrupted. Instead, the Akkadian kings presented themselves as the rightful successors to Sumerian traditions, as legitimate rulers who honored the gods and maintained the ancient ways. They restored temples, funded rituals, made lavish offerings. Sargon installed his daughter as high priestess at Yor-Prith, but the ceremonies she performed there were the same ones that had been performed for generations. This continuity served both religious and political purposes. It reassured the population that the cosmic order remained intact, that the gods were still honored, that the rhythms of sacred time continued unchanged, and it legitimized Akkadian rule, presenting the empire not as a foreign imposition, but as the natural continuation of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The administrative systems of the empire similarly blended traditions. The Akkadians didn't simply impose their own methods on conquered territories. Instead, they adopted much of what already worked in Sumerian administration. The systems that had been refined over centuries of urban life, and integrated them into their broader imperial structure. The basic unit of land measurement, the methods of recording transactions, the systems for tracking workers and resources. Much of this remained Sumerian in origin, even as it was incorporated into Akkadian imperial administration. Why reinvent what already worked? The Sumerians had developed effective administrative tools, and the Akkadians were pragmatic enough to use them. But the Akkadians also introduced innovations: the appointment of imperial governors, more centralized tax collection, standardization across wider territories. The result was a hybrid system, drawing on Sumerian precedents but adapted to imperial scale and purposes. Even in something as specific as cylinder seal art, we can see the fusion of styles. Cylinder seals continued to be used as they had been in Sumerian times, rolled across clay to create unique impressions that served as signatures and security devices. Put the images carved on Akkadian period seals often blended Sumerian and Akkadian artistic conventions. Some seals show traditional Sumerian religious scenes, but executed with the more dynamic, realistic Akkadian style. Others combine Sumerian and Akkadian deities in the same composition, acknowledging the merged pantheon. Still others show new motifs altogether, drawing on Semitic traditions but executed in the cuneiform-influenced artistic language of Mesopotamia. These small objects, intimate and personal, reflect the larger cultural synthesis happening across the empire. Artists and craftsmen didn't have to choose between Sumerian and Akkadian traditions. They could draw on both, creating works that honored the past while serving the present, that were recognizably Mesopotamian but also distinctly products of this new, unified age. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the bilingual scribe in his tablet house, switching fluidly between Sumerian and Akkadian, copying an ancient Sumerian hymn in the morning and drafting an Akkadian administrative document in the afternoon. Both languages live in his mind. Both traditions shape his thinking. Both heritages are his to draw upon. Picture Inhejuana in the temple at your performing ancient rituals that predate her grandfather's empire, speaking prayers in Sumerian that had been spoken for 1,000 years, but also composing new hymns that acknowledge the changed political landscape, that honor the goddess in ways that serve her father's imperial vision. Picture the temple workshops continuing their work as they always had. Weavers and metalworkers and potters producing goods for offerings and trade. But now, under the overall administration of Akkadian governors who respect and maintain the traditional systems while integrating them into larger imperial structures. Picture the seal carver at work, carefully incising a cylinder of lapis lazuli, with a scene showing both Sumerian and Akkadian deities, creating a miniature work of art that will authenticate documents, pen, secure property while also serving as a beautiful object. Its owner will treasure and eventually be buried. But with cultural fusion isn't always peaceful or voluntary, and the Akkadian conquest certainly involved violence and disruption. But once the conquest was complete, the result wasn't simple domination of one culture by another. Instead, Sumerian and Akkadian traditions intertwined, creating something new that drew strength from both sources. This pattern would repeat throughout Mesopotamian history. New peoples would arrive, new languages would become dominant, new empires would rise, but the Sumerian heritage would persist, preserved through translation and adaptation, honored as the foundation of all that came after, maintained by scribes who valued ancient wisdom and traditional learning. Asterisk, the Akkadians conquered Sumer politically, but culturally they were themselves conquered. Poor. Perhaps more accurately, the two cultures merged into something richer than either alone. Asterisk, Inanna and Ishtar. Two names for one goddess, watch over the sleeping world with patient, paternal eyes, bridging past and present, Sumerian and Akkadian, the ancient and the new. Asterisk, the Akkadian Empire, vast and powerful as it seemed, was not destined to last forever. No empire is. Around 2200 BCE, approximately a century and a half after Sargon's conquests, the climate itself turned against Mesopotamia. Modern scientific research has identified what's called the 4.2 kiloair event, a period of severe drought that affected much of the ancient world. The rains failed. Year after year, the skies remained clear when they should have brought water. Rivers ran lower than they had in living memory. Irrigation systems that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for millennia couldn't function properly without adequate water flow. crops withered in the fields. Famine spread across the land. This wasn't a crisis that could be solved through military might or administrative efficiency. You cannot conquer a drought. You cannot tax your way out of famine when there's no food to collect. The very foundation of the empire, its agricultural surplus, was undermined by forces completely beyond human control. The famine created cascading crises. Hungry people grow desperate and angry. Cities that couldn't feed their populations faced unrest. Regions that suffered most severely blamed the central government for failing to provide relief. The social contract that held the empire together, the exchange of taxes and loyalty for security and prosperity, broke down when the empire could no longer deliver its side of the bargain. Internal revolts began to flare up across the empire. Cities that had been conquered by Sargon and his successors, that had chafed under Akkadian rule even in good times, now saw an opportunity to reassert their independence. Why pay taxes to a distant king who couldn't ensure adequate food supplies? Why accept governors appointed from Akkad when local leadership might better manage the crisis? The standing army that had been the empire's strength was difficult to maintain during famine. Soldiers need to eat, and their families need to eat. And when food is scarce, military service becomes unsustainable. Eunuchs may have dissolved as men returned home to try to save their families. Loyalty to the empire weakened as immediate survival took priority. Into this weakened, crisis-ridden empire came the Gutians mountain people, from the Zagros range to the east. The historical sources are unclear about exactly who the Gutians were, or what motivated their movement into Mesopotamia. Were they invaders seeking plunder, migrants fleeing the same drought that afflicted the lowlands, opportunists taking advantage of Akkadian weakness? Whatever their motivations, the Gutians swept into Mesopotamia around 2154 BCE. The weakened Akkadian state couldn't mount effective resistance. City after city fell, or simply threw off Akkadian control amid the chaos. The centralized administration collapsed. The governors fled or were overthrown. The unified empire fragmented into competing powers and local authorities. Akkad itself, that capital city whose location we still don't know, was abandoned or destroyed. Later Mesopotamian texts speak of its ruins with a kind of awed horror, a great city reduced to desolation. The empire that had seemed so mighty, that had stretched from the Mediterranean to Iran, simply ceased to exist. The Mesopotamians needed to understand this catastrophe, to make sense of how such power could fall so completely. And so they created a literary work called The Curse of Akkad, a poem that explained the fall of Akkad in religious terms. According to this text, Naram-Sin had offended the gods through his arrogance and impiety, and in particular through an attack on the sacred city of Nippur and its temple to Enlil. The poem describes how Enlil, enraged by this sacrilege, cursed the city of Akkad and summoned the Gutians to destroy it. It's a powerful work, vivid in its descriptions of the city's destruction and clear in its moral message. Even the mightiest king must respect the gods and honor sacred places. Hubris, especially Naram-Sin's claim to divinity, brings divine punishment. Whether this religious explanation reflects actual historical events is debatable. Did Naram-Sin really attack Nipper? Did he commit some terrible sacrilege? Or is the poem a theological interpretation imposed on events after the fact, a way of maintaining belief in divine justice despite the apparent randomness of drought and invasion? We cannot know for certain, but the poem reveals how the Mesopotamians themselves understood and explained the catastrophe. Yet, remarkably, while the Akkadian Empire fell, Akkadian culture survived. Within a few generations of the empire's collapse, a new Sumerian dynasty arose in the city of Ur, what historians call the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur III. This dynasty reunified much of southern Mesopotamia and presided over what's sometimes called the Sumerian Renaissance, be a flowering of Sumerian literature and culture. But even this Sumerian revival was deeply influenced by Akkadian precedents. The Ur III state was highly bureaucratic and centralized, following the Akkadian imperial model rather than the old city-state pattern. And Akkadian continued to be used alongside Sumerian in administration and commerce. The cultural fusion that had occurred under the Akkadian Empire persisted and deepened. Sumerian survived, yes, but increasingly as a classical language, like Latin in medieval Europe. It was the language of the most ancient and sacred texts, the language learned in schools, the language of high literature and religious ritual, but for everyday purposes, for commerce and administration. Akkadian became increasingly dominant. This pattern would continue for centuries, even as political power shifted, even as new dynasties rose and fell. Akkadian remained the common language of Mesopotamia. It evolved into different dialects, Babylonian in the south and Assyrian in the north. But these were variations of the same language, mutually intelligible, sharing a literary tradition that stretched back to the Akkadian Empire and beyond. The kingdoms and empires that followed, Babylonia and Assyria, were direct cultural heirs of both Sumer and Akkad. Their languages were Akkadian. Their writing system was cuneiform, inherited from Sumer. Their gods were the merged Sumerian-Akkadian pantheon. Their literary traditions drew on both Sumerian originals and Akkadian adaptations. Their legal codes descended from Sumerian and Akkadian precedents. Perhaps most significantly, the model of imperial rule that Sargon had established became the Mesopotamian standard. Later rulers didn't go back to the old city-state system. Instead, they built empires, unified states controlling large territories through centralized administration. The Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian empires, and eventually the Persian Empire that conquered all of Mesopotamia, all followed this pattern. The institutions and ideas that had emerged in Sumer and been elaborated in Akkad became permanent features of Mesopotamian civilization. Writing continued, evolving and spreading to new languages, but maintaining its fundamental character. Law codes continued to be written and proclaimed, each one drawing on earlier precedents. building a continuous legal tradition. Kingship continued, with each ruler claiming to rule with divine approval, to maintain justice, to honor the gods. Later rulers, even those from completely different ethnic backgrounds, claimed Sumerian heritage. The Kassites, who ruled Babylonia for centuries. The Assyrian kings, who built a vast empire in the first millennium BC. Even the Persian kings, who conquered all of Mesopotamia, all presented themselves as legitimate heirs to the Sumerian tradition. They restored ancient Sumerian temples, copied Sumerian texts, claimed descent from legendary Sumerian kings. This reverence for the Sumerian past gave it a kind of immortality. Long after the last native speaker of Sumerian had died, long after the independent Sumerian city-states had vanished into history, Sumerian culture remained alive as a revered foundation, a classical heritage that later civilizations claimed and honored, and the fundamental achievement of Sumerian civilization. The creation of urban life, with all its complex institutions, never disappeared. Once humans had learned to live in cities, to organize themselves into states, to write and keep records, to create laws and literature, there was no going back. These innovations spread from Mesopotamia across the ancient world, touted it and modified by countless cultures, but always recognizable as developments of what had first emerged between the Tigris and Euphrates. Civilization itself, in the sense of complex urban society with writing and centralized government, specialized labor and monumental architecture, never looked back after its birth in Sumer. It spread to Egypt and the Indus Valley, to China and Mesoamerica, taking different forms in different places, but always building on the same fundamental innovations that the Sumerians had pioneered. As you drift into final, deep sleep, picture the long arc of history stretching from ancient Sumer to the present day. Picture those first cities rising from the Mesopotamian plain, ziggurats reaching toward the heavens, canals channeling water to thirsty fields. Picture the scribes learning to write, pressing wedges into clay, creating the first literature, the first laws, the first historical records. Picture Sargon of Akkad creating the first empire, unifying diverse peoples under a single rule, establishing patterns of government that would echo through millennia. Picture Enheduanna composing her hymns, bridging cultures and languages, ensuring that Sumerian literature would survive even as Sumerian ceased to be spoken. Picture the drought coming, the rains failing, the empire collapsing under pressures it couldn't resist. Picture the Gushans sweeping down from the mountains, the cities falling, the great capital of Akkad reduced to ruins. Picture the survivors trying to make sense of the catastrophe, creating stories that would explain what had happened in terms that made sense to them. And then picture the recovery, the resilience of human culture. You're the third dynasty rebuilding. The scribes still copying ancient texts, the temples still performing ancient rituals, the Babylonians and Assyrians carrying forward the heritage, adapting it, adding to it, ensuring its continuity. Picture the Persian king Cyrus, Centuries later, restoring the temple of Marduk in Babylon, claiming to be the rightful king chosen by the gods, presenting himself as the heir to Mesopotamian tradition, even though he came from a completely different culture. Picture the Greek scholars in the Hellenistic period, studying Babylonian astronomy and mathematics, incorporating Mesopotamian knowledge into their own learning. Picture the continuity of ideas across cultures and centuries, each civilization building on what came before. And finally, picture the archaeologists of the 19th and 20th centuries, excavating the ruins of Sumerian cities, deciphering cuneiform tablets, recovering the voices of the ancient past. Picture the scholars realizing that they had found the very beginning of written history, the origins of so much that we take for granted. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people, and they built something that would outlast their own civilization by millennia. They invented writing and cities, mathematics and literature, law codes and empires. They wrestled with the same questions we still face: how to live together in large groups, how to govern justly, how to find meaning in a universe that doesn't always make sense, how to leave something lasting behind when our individual lives are so brief. They found answers, imperfect but real, and they wrote those answers down in clay that would survive when stone had crumbled, when wood had rotted, when metal had corroded. Their tablets speak to us still, across 4,000 years and more, telling us about their lives, their beliefs, their achievements and failures. Rest now in the knowledge that you are connected to this ancient heritage, that the civilization we inhabit today, with all its complexity and achievement, stands on foundations laid in between the rivers where it all began. The black-headed people are gone, but their legacy remains, woven so deeply into human culture that we can barely distinguish what came from them and what we created ourselves. Sleep peacefully, bare as the same stars that guided Sumerian farmers to their fields, that marked time for Akkadian astronomer, that witnessed the rise and fall of empires shine down on you tonight. The wheel still turns, the hours still divide into minutes and seconds, the laws still seek justice, the writing still preserves knowledge, and the dream of civilization, first dreamed in Sumer, continues. Good night, and may your dreams be peaceful, filled with the gentle sounds of ancient lyres and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some things, some important things, truly do endure across the vast river of time that separates us from our ancient ancestors who first learned to write, to build cities, and to dream of lasting achievements. Sleep well.